Hello, this is Silas. This is part 2 in my series on the Black Lives Matter activist movement. The first part was called Black Lives Matter, and I suggest you watch that if you haven't seen this one before, as it goes into some history of both why I'm doing this series and also the history of the actual activist movement itself that started in the United States of America within the Black American community or the Black community in the United States of America, who were ostensibly protesting due to the treatment, or they say the institutionalized racism, amongst other things, that exist in the United States of America. And this is an activist movement kind of fighting and protesting and doing other things that have come together to combat this injustice that they see in society. And this movement has now become international, and since its beginning about 2 or 3 years ago, recording this in 2017, it has grown to become an international movement with different parts and aspects and branches in different continents and countries. So I'm going to get right into this one, and the title of this video, this part of the series, is White Lies About Black Lives Matter. So I will discuss 3 pervasive white lies associated with Black Lives Matter. The 3 are the effects of white privilege, the complicity of white silence, and the general makeup of the white race. This is the second entry, as I said, and Black Lives Matter was the first one, and in that one I had also said with the title of that, with Black Lives Matter, kind of showing the difference between white lies and black lies, so I'm bringing that back in this one, where a white lie in general is supposedly something that's told that's not as damaging as a black lie, and so I want to kind of juxtapose those two together in this one. So the roots of it, I think that's at the beginning. Now this is a white lies, 3 of the white lies. This is part of what's built on that initial root of the actual part that should matter to all of you. The first white lie I'm going to discuss is that of white privilege. So with this, it is just privilege, a subjective term that does exist. Some that have it happen to be white, however you want to define that term, white. Is living in the White House, being part of the most highly paid couple in the entertainment industry, or being a record-setting athlete considered to be a privilege? So when they do this by limiting it to white privilege, limiting this privilege to a select class of people, then the once president of the most powerful country in the world can praise Black Lives Matter for speaking truth to power, since his blackness renders him unable to wield the power that is a prerequisite of privilege. It enables one half of the most well-paid couple in the entertainment industry to boldly declare support for Black Lives Matter and feminism while touring in Europe, because as a black female, she is doubly powerless and removed from privilege. It is how a record-setting tennis player can win the famous Wimbledon tournament, watched by the aforementioned couple, hold her fist up in a sign of rejoicing and black power, and yet have people argue that other tennis players make more than she does due to her suffering from a racism handicap. They claim that the only power she has is in her arm strength, and that power gets her referred to as an animal, further deriding her. This tendency to compare athletes to bestial things or anything but a human in performance is of course not something that non-black athletes are ever subjected to. So let me torpedo that boat before you even try to sail that what about the whites, what about the other people thing. So back to this. The Obama family, Jay-Z and Beyonce, Serena Williams, and many others. Black by definition by almost anybody in the Black Lives Matter movement, but do they lack privilege? How many of you, white or not, are more privileged than these 3 examples that I gave? Now on to the argument that privilege is not defined by one's actions and character, but instead what somebody else assumes of them. It's true, people make assumptions. If I have a math problem and I decide to ask a random Asian walking by me, only to have them get it wrong, where is the privilege there? Assumptions can yield negative or positive results. Is it mostly negative for blacks? A regular example being that they cannot walk into a store without feeling others may assume that they're a criminal due to the disproportionate level of crime committed by people of said skin color. People profile, sure. Feelings are not an argument though, nor can they make you something you are not. Little concern is spared for the feelings of people assumed to be racist due to how a small percentage of white and black people held a large number of black and white people enslaved generations ago. If what other black people do currently should not be applied to how people perceive you, then why do you perceive them on things that happened in the past? If you were not aware of my race, what assumptions would you have made by listening to this so far? White privilege is a lie. It is not about race or privilege. As I mentioned in the previous post, I had just walked through a Black Lives Matter protest and I was expecting a dinner guest. So once the dinner guest arrived, various subjects came up, including how our days went, and I told them about the Black Lives Matter protest that I walked through. They decided to say at this point that they were very aware of their white privilege. And then I quickly excused myself at that point and asked them for some clarification. I told them, as a straight male, did my privilege outweigh his as a gay male? Then if that was the case, did we have to retally our privilege points at that point? Did we have to add in the fact that he was an American and I was Kenyan by citizenry? Are there things like first world points or developing world points that we have to retally again? Do we have to retally the fact that in the current country that we're in, he was a citizen and I was an immigrant? So this could have gone on for a while, and as I said to him, we all have privileges, disadvantages, and challenges. The most one can hope for is to be as successful at doing what exactly it is that they want to do. So on to the next point, white silence. As many Black Lives Matter protests are, the one I had walked through earlier that day was a multiracial event in any way you'd want to define race. So while crossing through, I noticed a few signs referring to white silence. You know, the dun-dun-dun, the dreaded white silence. This term is, so it's a bit perplexing to me if I believe this had anything to do with race and reason to have something like white silence as a term that people would actually use seriously. One of the regular demands of people in the Black Lives Matter movement is that more room be made for black people to speak. They state that since they themselves are black people, they have the lived experience that is a prerequisite to be able to understand black issues. I even just recently made a video talking about former First Lady Michelle Obama, who stated that she was sitting watching the State of the Union address, which to me, that's a privilege, being able to sit in the State of the Union address. She's pointing out how one side, ostensibly the Republican side, is old white males, and then the other side, ostensibly the Democrat side, has some brown people, some women. That's the whole stating that the lived experience is what is required for you to actually be able to speak about issues involving that people, that identity group. So if living black is a prerequisite to speak about the black condition, then shouldn't whites be silent? Inversely, if white silence is a problem, then how would anything they say have validity, as they would lack what one needs to properly understand and articulate the issues at hand, and those things needed are being black yourself. So this appeal to authority is a familiar tactic. I've seen it used by many other faith-based movements such as modern feminism, when they say that men cannot speak about women's issues. They then go further to admonish any for trying to participate in this by saying that they are committing the sin of mansplaining and that more room should be made for female voices. As I mentioned before with the example of Michelle Obama, or former First Lady Michelle Obama, she seems to be an adherent to multiple religions. So when it comes to this situation of the female voices being made, who should empower and make room for these females? Why, the men, of course. If one must be X to speak about X issue, then blacks or females, being neither white or male, would disqualify themselves to speak about their oppressor groups and experience, and or be able to speak about them. So you'd think with certain movements like the he for she thing that was going on in the United Nations, where it was men supposedly to speak for women, so maybe they should initiate another program, possibly called something like We for BLM or Y for Blah, or something like that, just to show the white for blacks. So the lie about white silence to me is rather absurd. White people have the privilege of being damned if they do and damned if they don't. So if you speak, what you say is racist. If you're silent, you're a racist enabler. You move away from a location, that's white flight. You move back to a location, it's gentrification. Want to enforce immigration laws in your country, you're racists who don't care about brown or black people. Want to go to other countries and get involved there, you're an imperialist oppressor who wants to change and steal from black and brown countries and cultures. A small percent participate in the global practice of slavery, then all white people today benefit from it and are culpable. A larger percentage die in the fight to abolish the practice of slavery, then some of those fighting own slaves. On to the next lie, the white race. Black Lives Matter does not care about the entire world, nor do I expect them or others to do so. I agree with those that say all lives matter is patently wrong. Even if possible, outside the general sense of holding humans over other life forms, would it be practical and or positive? We did not evolve in a way that grants us the ability to truly appreciate, value, or care for that many people. My nephew, for example, matters more to me than essentially any other 2 and 8-month-year-old. The children that any of my friends have matter more to me than those of strangers, and at this moment, you, dear listener, matter more to me than somebody who is not currently listening to this recording. So this is something I agree with Black Lives Matter on, that not all Black Lives matter. Regardless though, as humans, we know of the world. We are aware of the entire human race, at least to a certain extent. And we can try to take that into account. The Black Lives Matter movement, however, does not. If a supporter or member of Black Lives Matter did care about the world, was aware of the world, they would throw away the minority-majority dichotomy that they use, since they would have to admit that whites are a global minority by a vast margin. Even if you count for the white Hispanics, as during the Trayvon Martin case, the infamous Trayvon Martin case, I was informed that George Zimmerman was. So will they ever be a white-Asian distinction, I'm wondering, to deal with people like, maybe to defer the Chinese and Japanese and Koreans from, let's say, the Asians, like the Bangladeshi or the Indians or the Thai or something like that. I don't know if that will ever happen. Hopefully we'll be over some of this race shenanigans before we get to that point. So if they cared more about Africa, and not just focused on a minority of issues that a select group of its recent descendants that are currently living in parts of the Western world were dealing with, these people living in predominantly and historically white countries and cultures, they would know that African is not a culture, race, or people, but a designation of location. North of the Sahara Desert is essentially the Middle East by religion, racial makeup, and more. When you look at the countries south of the Sahara, most people do not only vary by region, country, but they still have very strong ties to tribe. And if you look at it even more specifically, when you're talking about citizenship or location-wise, the most popular sub-Saharan African woman alive today, for most of the people in the West, is most likely white, and that is Charlize Theron, who is from South Africa. So you want to know where else diversity actually abounds? In Europe. The insinuation that there is some sort of black or white monoculture should not continue. In Italy, you will still find distinct differences in villages kilometers apart, or a few miles apart for my non-European listeners. The dialects, customs, foods, and traditions are more unique and important to those that live there. There is notable diversity to be seen a few kilometers apart, let alone if you compare the Sicilians living in the southern island of Sicily to the Turinese living in the feet of the Alps and the northern parts of Italy. This is not about race, it is about humanity. Now, if one is cursed by this trinity of white guilt, yet still wants to help, a potential white ally, unable to speak or silent, may choose to share someone else's thoughts. An example is a post about someone's reactions to an old white guy telling a young black female activist that if he, Alton Sterling, who was shot in an incident that I've discussed in a previous video, had complied with the officer's commands, he would be alive today. In an attempt to discredit this conservative habit of providing examples and analogies, they provided a series of if-then examples to establish their case for a greater cause and effect leading up to the Alton Sterling issue. This began at American slavery in 1619 and ended with a system of violent white supremacy beginning centuries before its founding and continuing up to its present moment that explains why the lives of Sterling and Castile ended. That one could provide 14 examples of things white people ostensibly did to powerless black people to show how disgusting it is to suggest a black person had the agency to control something and took no notice of it, used to frighten me. Over a decade ago, I thought similar things. I was wrong. If I shared them with you, I apologize. I've long since tried to establish the connections that these 14 examples were alluding to, and similar things like this, and they have been proven to be unfounded. People such as Dr. Thomas Sowell have done much more to combat this view that black people are just tools or objects that are acted on, but it still persists. Whether through ignorance, complicity, insanity, virtue signaling, or anything else, we can ill afford to allow claims like this to go unchallenged. The person who wrote this is wrong. The person who shared it is wrong. It is wrong. That it was shared under the declaration that we need to do so much better teaching our own history is notable. Who is in charge of teaching history, and which of those 14 examples of white power and lack of black agency go against the narrative that is taught? Answer this and you will be closer to the main source of this and many other problems. The current combative climate is not entirely about race. The focus on race, though, may be an unintended yet somewhat convenient result of those fanning the flames through rhetoric, fear-mongering, and controlling of narratives. But I do not see a race war coming, or actually going on right now, as some might claim that it does. All of us have certain privileges. Most of us are silent about things we should speak up about. Many of us prefer to be with people we identify with, be it by race, religion, language, fandom, culture, or many other distinctions of varying validity. As you listen to this, can you say that you have been as successful at what you have chosen to do as Barack Obama, Beyonce, or Serena Williams have been at what they chose to do? So tell me about how institutionally oppressed by whites that they are. Tell me how white voices need to empower them, or did empower them. How their actions are not the results of their agency. If you consider yourself white, tell me how you, in your whiteness, need to empower me. Tell me that and identify yourself as a racist. Okay, so back to the dinner that we were having. So later that night, possibly in reference to hearing a report that 5 black people in Baltimore had been shot while attending the wake of a rapper that had been shot the night before that. And it was actually in the location of another infamous case that Black Lives Matter was up in arms about, involving this person called Freddie Gray, who was caught up and carried in a police vehicle, and during that ride and sustained some injuries that led to his death. The case ended up with 3 of the officers being acquitted, and then the case was thrown out. I haven't really followed the case that much since then, but you can look that up. So back to those 5 shootings. No video or images had surfaced, and likewise, no protests by Black Lives Matter. Those were not the deaths that they were looking for. I read a comment on that story that said, the way so many of us are dying, there may be some government involvement behind this. So after overcoming the temptation to just wave it off as conspiracy theorizing, in the continued attempt to actually get to the true meaning of things, I asked myself, what do they actually mean by that? Could they be something behind what I just heard or read from the first look? So when they say this government behind it, government involvement, it doesn't have to mean a false flag thing. It doesn't have to be government hitmen or any other tinfoil hat kind of scheme responsible for the killings and the deaths that were going on in the black community. Could it be an awareness of the policies that fund, feed on, and foment the environments in which so many find themselves hardly able to live in, and too many are certain to die of? If Black Lives Matter was a call to have what they do in their lives matter more, if it was a call to agency, I can get behind that. If it was an awakening to how they are living on a modern-day plantation, enslaved to a master who harvests their vote and breeds them, caring for them as a farmer does livestock, I could get behind that. Could the Black Lives Matter movement be an expression of this reality? Is it possible that as longtime slaves may not know the language of freedom, that there may be a lack within the black community of how to describe their situation in a more constructive way? In the next part, I will discuss my attempt to figure out the motivations behind the Black Lives Matter movement. What I found unfortunately indicates that many of its core members, principals, and supporters are in no way awakening to reality. Instead, if and when exposed to it, they are willingly ignorant of reality when not directly opposed to it. So that was part 2 of the series that I wrote back a few years ago. And just going back through reading that and trying to get it out, I'm editing some of my older posts and thinking, okay, how was I writing at that point? And that point in the end there where I said, getting the idea out in a more constructive way, seeing an issue and not being quite sure how to express it. I see ways I was writing before and trying to edit it and thinking, okay, I thought at that time this was something that was good to read. And I'm trying to read it out in a video form here and realizing, wow, it's not just changing from written form to video, how you communicate in a different way when conversing to somebody versus them reading what you're writing. It's just the way I was writing, the run-on sentences. I wasn't really taking into account how people were going to experience it. I didn't have an editor for some of these things, just something that I'm thinking it's good to bounce these ideas off of other people. And also just changing that time, the things that I've learned and the mentality that I have today compared to the years ago when I was thinking about this and wondering how is this movement going to go. And unfortunately, it still has gone in the negative directions that I was afraid it would go through. So that was the video for today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And till next video, I'll try to get the next part up rather soon. And this has been Silas. Like, share, and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, click the notification bell. I've been told that some people are not really getting updates on the videos. And I also have a Facebook, I also have a Facebook group. If you guys are on Facebook, you can join the Facebook group, and that will also give you notifications, and you can maybe participate in the community there. But yeah, so that's it for now. Till next video. Goodbye.